Here we are with part 2, and this second part is really going to solidify some evidence against evolutionary claims. Here is the second problem I have with evolution. Most of evolution's claims are fraudulent, or half-truths at best. For instance, you might read in an evolutionary textbook, we share 80% of our DNA with apes. With apes? Wow. We're very similar. And yet, we take a look at our DNA compared to the DNA of bananas, and we share 50% of our DNA with bananas. And so, we think about it and we're like, well, why on earth would we share this fact as astounding when this fact kind of makes this fact sound not so astounding? And I'm not just, making this up. We can go and say, how much DNA do humans share with bananas? And it turns out we share 50% of our DNA with bananas. So strange. But it really makes evolution sound silly at that point. Because humans and plants, not very related on the evolutionary tree, right? Here's another one. Haeckel's embryos. Ernst Haeckel was a biologist who studied embryos, and he drew out diagrams like this, and he said, here's a fish, here's a salamander, here's a tortoise, here's like a chicken, a hog, and a human. Wow. We look a whole lot similar to these other guys. I mean, I can kind of see where you might get a baby human mixed up with like a baby rabbit. That's not good. We must have came from the same genetic line. And yet it turns out that Haeckel, before the end of his life, admitted to fraud. He made all this stuff up. Now, of course, there are some similarities between... Where's my pointer? There are some similarities between the embryos of these things. It's not what I'm saying. But his pictures are a fraud. That diagram is not true. And yet that diagram is shown in every public school textbook today. Why are we showing things that aren't true? You know why? Because they're very convincing. Here's another one. Leftover organs from evolutionism. They're called vestigial. For instance, let's think about our appendix. Well, our appendix, of course, is a little organ that's in our stomach region. And what's the appendix famous for? It's famous for exploding, right? And causing all sorts of abdominal discomfort. That's hard to say. And you see, what they claim, evolutionists claim, is that appendix was useful in one of our previous lives, but we evolved away from its use. That's why it's still there. Is we haven't necessarily evolved it away, but we've evolved away from it being useful. And you think about it and you're like, well, why would God give us something we just can't use? But the more we discover about the genetic code, the more we discover that they're actually pretty useful after all. We find that the appendix actually, and we found this out very recently, the appendix actually deals with protecting the embryo of an unborn child from disease. Isn't that weird? The appendix isn't functional because it's only functional before we're even born. Well, that's incredible. And it turns out that everything in our body is there for a purpose. Even DNA that we have, because 60% of our DNA, by the way, doesn't do anything. It's junk DNA. So evolutionists are like, well, that's left over from our previous lives. But we learn that if we take it out, our body doesn't work. Well, it has to do something, right? Even though it's technically junk DNA. It turns out that everything in our body is there for a purpose. And that defies evolutionism. Here's evidence number 3. The lack of transitional fossils. Why don't we find things transitioning from one state to the next. Here's a great example. The Cambrian explosion. You can ask any evolutionary biologist, hey, when do plants appear in the fossil record? And they'll say, the Cambrian period. It's called the Cambrian explosion. Well, what did things eat before plants? I don't know. They have no clue. And it turns out that all the plants appeared at the same time in the record. So mosses, a very simple plant, and like broadleaf trees evolved at the same time. How does that work? Right? We're supposed to go from simple to complex, and yet everything appeared at the same time in the fossil record. That shouldn't be. We should see mosses at the bottom of the fossil record. They're kind of, very simple, and then above them are some grasses, which are a little bit more complex, and then some shrubs, and then some trees. Right, we just see them all together. That doesn't make sense. It would make sense with a flood, though, that just buried everything, right? How about this one? Living fossils, like the coelacanth. And so this guy here, this ugly fellow, he's supposed to be extinct. You see, evolutionists claimed that 30 million years ago, during the Devonian period, or the Devonian age, the age of fish, this guy went extinct until somebody brought him up on a fishing line in the middle of the ocean and said, hey, what's this thing? And it took an archaeologist to name what that fossil was. It's called a living fossil. It hasn't evolved in 30 million years, according to evolutionists. How do things just not evolve? If evolution's based on evolving, why would something not evolve? That doesn't make sense, right? And even the professor of Yale was like, that doesn't make sense. It really doesn't. Just didn't have to. That's what he says. Polystrate fossils moving through multiple fossil layers. This kills evolutionary argument. If you type polystrate fossils in on Google, every single link is going to direct you to... Here, let me show you. I'm not making this up. Polystrate. Fossils. The first result are not real fossils. And Google or Wikipedia has a page, and just about every link, everyone that's sharing anything about polystrate fossils, Institute for Creation Research, creation.com, the Creation Club, creation.com. Why isn't an evolutionary site sharing these things? Because they're trying to suppress the truth. They're saying that, no, we're not going to show that because that defies evolution. Right? A polystrate fossil is one that extends through multiple layers. If each of these layers is millions of years, how did a tree survive, what is that, maybe 50 million years? Trees around here don't survive wind from a hurricane, right? How does a tree survive for 50 million years? The oldest trees we know of are 4,000 years old. And so it turns out that it would have been impossible for these trees to survive 50 million years. You ask an evolutionist why there's polystrate fossils, and they literally say, I don't know. The tree just somehow survived. And they say over the course of time, maybe one or two survived, but we find these polystrate fossils everywhere. We find hundreds in the fossil record. In fact, we find polystrate whales, meaning that whales actually extend through millions of years of stratum, which means that a whale stuck in the air for 100 million years and didn't move. Didn't get eaten by anything, nothing. He just stayed there as a fossil record was being formed. Sounds kind of crazy to me. Of course, no credible ape-to-human fossil. There's tons being attempted to identify. We have models all over the world that's trying to come up with some credible ape-to-human fossil, and we're just not finding anything. Lucy's the best we got, and Lucy's a really poor example. Here's evidence number 4. Evolution said things go from simple to complex being simple is impossible. The simplest thing we know of in the world is called mycoplasma, and it is 580,000 base pairs long. Letters of the genetic code. That's not very simple. Some evolutionists say, well, the first organisms then had to be even simpler, like viruses. Those aren't alive, and those will transition from from non-life to life. What's the problem with a virus being the first thing that's alive? How do viruses make more viruses? They infect you. This coronavirus is only spreading because it's using you as a host. It's infecting you to make more of itself. Well, then, hold on. What would a retrovirus, being the first thing in life, infect? Nothing. It couldn't infect anything. So an evolutionist could say, oh yeah, retroviruses are first life, yeah. What does it infect? I just don't know. They have nothing that the retrovirus infects. Specified complexity shows us that all the parts had to come at the same time. Think about your eye. Think about your eyeball. All the things that are going on there. The retina, the iris, the vitreous fluid, all the different components. The optic vein, or the optic nerve, the oculomotor nerve, the trochlear, the trigeminal. There's all kinds of nerves connected to the eye. But why would one develop without all the rest? Why would your body randomly create a hole in its head? That would leave you exposed to danger. And you have to have a hole to have an eye, right? All those things had to come at the same time. It's a principle in biology. Specified complexity is. And yet, specified complexity doesn't allow for evolution. It allows for change when something's already there. It would allow us to get a smaller eye or a bigger eye over generations, right? Different colored eyes, but not something new. Here's the second to last nail in evolution's coffin. I have to hurry because I only have 15 minutes. Evolution defies laws. The second law of thermodynamics. It says that order becomes disorder. That less enthalpy is another word for usable energy, occurs over time. And yet evolution defies that. It says, no. The disorderly must become orderly. The simple must become complex. But if you look at like a tornado going through a trailer park, you're not going to create mansions. What are you going to create? You're going to create destruction. And yet random forces acting on random elements somehow created non-randomness out of randomness. That doesn't make sense. That is a total evidence against evolution. And this is where we lead to blind allegiance. Don't have blind allegiance. This guy here, Richard Dawkins, okay, he is the foremost expert on evolution. This guy is probably the most famous evolutionist in our world today. He's been a professor at like 700 different colleges, everything. Here's his quotes. We don't need fossils. We don't even need them. The case for evolution's watertight. Maybe in his mind, but I like to have something to look at and believe in order to see whether or not it's true. I mean, if I randomly told you, hey, man, I gave you a new car, it's right outside, what would you do? You'd go look to see if I got a new car for you. You wouldn't just believe me randomly. The essence of life is improbability on a colossal scale. No, it's impossibility. Evolutionism also gives reason for others to believe in some really weird things like the Gaia theory, the Gaia hypothesis, Mother Earth, that Earth takes care of its own, tree-hugging stuff, but to the extreme. Here's another one, racial prejudice. Charles Darwin, he hated African Americans because he thought they were a lower race. And lastly, eugenics. If some genes are better than others, then we got to control whose genes go on to the next generation. Think China. All right, see ya.